The sound of pages turning means it's time for another episode from the Meredith Library podcast studio, bringing you the library's latest news, information, and fun.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to episode number 51 of Check It Out here at the Meredith Library podcast studio. Mary Beth was not here with me when I interviewed today's guest. However, she will return for the next episode, and I know she misses all of you. So this is part 2 of the fascinating interview I did with archivist Carola Davis, who is mostly retired, but a volunteer here with the Friends of the Meredith Library. Carola has organized our library archives as detailed in today's interview. She also talks about her fascinating career, which took her around the country and around the entire world. We left off part 1 at something of a cliffhanger. I had asked Carola to detail any experiences she had visiting or working in famous archives such as the Vatican Archives or the National Archives of the United States. So we're starting part 2 of this interview right in the middle of her answering that question.
I spent a fascinating week at the Eastman House, which is founder of Kodak in upstate New York, and they have probably the United States' most prestigious and developed school for studying and understanding photographic materials and film. And they do a lot of old film restoration there. But we were looking at photos and films under microscopes to understand the layers of chemicals and how photographs are made through all of their various stages of development from the very beginning with daguerreotypes on glass plates and tintypes on tin and every other kind of photography that came after that, and negatives when we got into that, because you need to know how to preserve those things, and they take special preservation. Mm-hmm. And that was really fascinating. And then I've been to numerous park sites, like one very interesting place I spent a lot of time at every year, several weeks, was Kalapapa in Hawaii, which is on the island of Molokai. And there's a national park there that preserves the history of the leprosy patients that still live there. There's a number of them. They don't have Hansen's disease anymore, but because they were taken there as children or, and separated from their families, the state is obligated to take care of them to the end of their life. And so they've chosen to stay there and live there for their lives. And I got to know those patients and wonderful people. And then I also went to American Samoa to look at their archives in their national park. And the year after I did a survey there, a tsunami came and washed over the entire building.
And ruined all the material?
And, some of it. But what they could recover right away was put into a container and frozen. And that's something when paper gets wet, if you can put it into a freezer, you can recoup a lot of it.
Ooh, that's a good tip. I love that. We have practical tips for household tips too thrown in. I love that. So, that's brilliant.
On a major level, this is what the people do. And that was flown then to Honolulu, and then from there to Texas, and then to a company that does recovery processes like this. So they rehydrate, they take all the water out of the paper, and then they put it through gamma radiation because the tsunami waves have a lot of pollution in them. And so when we opened the boxes, after that, sand just poured out from the dehydration process, and it just smelled like the Samoa beach.
Right. This is amazing. This is like something from a science fiction movie almost.
Yeah, and so we had to go through all that material and see what could be saved and reformatted and things like that. Mm-hmm. And one of the most exciting archives that I worked on was Guillermo Marconi, who founded radio.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And one of my big heroes.
Yep.
I had a radio station at the national park where I worked in Point Reyes National Seashore, and it was the largest radio station that was built in 1913, and it was a ship to shore, this is before commercial radio. Radio started out with ship to shore communications, because you think about it, before that, you take a ship out to sea, there's no way to know whatever happened if it doesn't come back?
Right,
There's
exactly.
no communication.
Mm-hmm.
And so radio was huge. And Marconi's ambition was to make a girdle around the world of connected radio stations, which he achieved. His archives from those radio stations are in that national park. Marconi's daughter, who is in her 90s now, she lives in Rome. And 2 years ago, I went to visit her in Rome, and she received me in her father's palace where she lives now in downtown Rome. And I was able to go into her home and have tea and talk with her about her father. She's written a lot about her father's legacy and has tried to keep what he achieved in the public memory through archives and other initiatives.
I love that you have all these insights. And, and people who are listening, you might be inspiring some young people who would have no idea that being an archivist would take them around the country and around the world. All right, well, since I just mentioned young people who might be listening, why don't we talk about the career path then for people who are interested in archival work?
Well, as I said, after your education and if have a particular bent in the kind of archives environment you want to work in, there are, the professional organizations like the Society of American Archivists is the premier one. And they have a website where there's job offerings in every kind of field, from church archives to media archives. I worked with a lot of graduate students as interns. They ended up working at places like Pixar and Lucasfilm and the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences and, all kinds of different museums. And so you can step into many different kinds of institutions, whether it's corporate archives, medical archives, law archives. So if you have a particular interest, you can sort of find the internships that fit that sort of thing and see if it's really for you.
Yeah, that makes sense. I remember reading years ago, I think when I was a teenager, about Coca-Cola in Atlanta having corporate archives, and they were talking about how they had all the old advertising.
Yes, and that's one of the ads I saw on the website yesterday.
All right. And so I guess after all this, we should ask, how did you end up here at the Meredith Library in our archives?
In 2017, I retired from the National Park Service from my full-time job, and my husband and I decided to move back here to New England. He's a New Englander.
Okay. So he was coming home.
Yes.
Well, we're glad you chose Meredith. Then we get to meet you and get this fascinating story and all the wonderful work you've done here as a volunteer, which I know people appreciate and are very thankful for, and it makes a big difference here at the library.
Thank you. My places of refuge are usually libraries since
Makes
I was
sense.
a child. and
We'd never guess.
and art galleries. And so I started visiting those in Meredith and meeting some people, and I decided to volunteer for Friends of the Library here. And the library had just also been added on to in another big project. And I just thought this was a really, really wonderful library with a great staff and lots of interesting programs going on.
Yes.
And when Erin, the director, found out that I knew something about archives, she asked me to look at the archives in the basement and take a look and see what I might be able to accomplish.
Yes, and good news for people who are interested in our archives here now. They are no longer in the basement. Can you explain the process of how you tackled and organized the Meredith Library archives you found in the basement?
There were about 4 6-drawer file cabinets that were deep file cabinets, and what I start out doing is surveying each drawer and making lists of the files that are in there and starting to try to understand whether there's original order. And that's something, it's sort of the first law of archives, is to establish whether the people who put these records together put them in some kind of order.
That makes sense, sure.
Because you want to, as much as possible, keep that order if it makes sense. Then also looking for things that are related. So maybe part of the drawings for the new edition are in this drawer and part of them are in this other drawer. And so, trying to make relationships between things. So we ended up in this collection with 8 different series, and they were things like all of those ledgers I told you about were sort of the statistical things that the library needed to report to the state every year. And then the library business, and then there was a history series about, how the library came to be and some of the people that were instrumental in creating this library.
Mm-hmm.
And also, there is a book written by Rudy Van Vetten of the Meredith Historical Society about the entire history of this library, which helped me a lot in understanding all the records I was looking at.
Yes, and we actually have that book available for sale right near the circulation desk. So everyone can run out and get their own copy. And Rudy comes every Wednesday to the Shakespeare group, and I bet he'd be glad to sign it for you too.
And then I had to go through each folder after I organized them, pull out all the staples because we don't want any metal in the folders. It rusts and stains the paper and can rip the paper. And so you have to remove every staple.
That makes perfect sense, yes.
And go through the files, see if there's duplicates, see if there's things that don't belong there. So basically going through almost every piece of paper, kind of organizing it maybe by date within the folder. The other process, once that physical process is sort of done, is to create a finding aid. And a finding aid is more expansive than, say, a catalog record for a book or something like that, because every single file is described in there. So the person looking at the finding aid can start out with a little history. What's this collection about?
Mm-hmm.
That turned out to be about 80 pages long in this
Wow.
collection. So it's a pretty big collection.
But it's extremely well organized. I mean, and anyone who's listening to these details that you're describing should know that the process comes out to a very user-friendly result, right? Because
that is what you're going for, definitely, because there's no use in preserving these collections if people don't use them.
Exactly.
And so that's what we're striving for, them to be viable into the future. Well, I wanted to let listeners know that since I just completed this project, which I worked on for many Wednesday afternoons for maybe 2 years or so.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that, how long it took. It definitely was a years-long process.
Yeah, I mean, once a week for a few hours, so I don't know. But it's done, and the finding aid will be available soon on the library website, so the public can access that. And also, one of the librarians here scanned all of the photos, and those soon will be available as well. And, some people who are interested in genealogy may want to access this collection because some of the old ledgers have lots of early residents' names in Meredith, so you might be able to find some connections there. There's lots of photos that have people whose pictures were taken in the 1980s, maybe as children or adults, and you might find pictures of yourself or your family in there.
Mm-hmm. At events here at the library, yes.
And just some of the historic things, if you're writing about, the area that you might find of interest, both landscapes and events. So those are some of the things that people could access in this collection. So I hope it gets some good use.
And that's one of the reasons why we have you here today, to publicize what's available and get people excited about checking out this stuff, the material we make available to them. So I know we were talking a little bit as we've gone along today about preserving the materials. So what are some tips and tricks to preserve delicate and fragile materials, such as our 100-year-old newspapers that fall apart when you pick them up? Mary Beth and I talked in a previous episode about getting the 1901, the year that the library building opened. We were looking at the 1901 issue from June of the Meredith News, and that actually was kind of happening. We were afraid to touch it because you could see pieces like disintegrating as you tried to turn the page. So as an archivist, that probably upsets you greatly. So how can we prevent that from happening? And what do you do besides digitizing, of course?
Newspapers in particular have something called inherent vice. And inherent vice is because of the material that newspapers are made from, which is the sort of cheapest wood pulp that has a lot of lignin, which is sort of a natural polymer in it, and it yellows and gets brittle.
Yes.
There's really nothing you can do to keep that from happening unless, I shouldn't say there's nothing, there are treatments, but when newspapers are bound in volumes and there's also a huge amount of them, it's very costly. They can be run through a giant machine if they're not too fragile. And luckily, the Meredith News was microfilmed some time ago when it was in better condition. And the library's been able to take that microfilm and convert it into digital format that's searchable. And so now we have a new archive. And many, many newspapers have taken this route because newspapers will disintegrate over time.
Mm-hmm.
One thing about any kind of paper material is that there's something called the agents of deterioration. And those are about 9 different things that you can help to control the disintegration of things, because everything disintegrates over time.
Right. Is humidity one of those factors?
Humidity is a huge factor. Climate control, a lot of archives have climate control for that reason, to try to keep the humidity and the temperature at a steady environment helps. Also, pests are a big problem. So you have things like silverfish or beetles or mice or things that can get into an archive and eat the paper collections.
Mm-hmm. Literally, yes.
Literally. And so, putting out pest traps and monitoring what's on the floor in your archive. And, there's also things like controlling light.
Mm-hmm.
That's an important factor, too, because light also is hard on paper. It can cause ink to fade. It causes damage to the paper. So say you have a historical photo and you want to put it in a frame and hang it on a wall, you have to consider the light and other kinds of damage that might happen to that. So you might want to make a facsimile of that and hang that up instead for display. And
Sure.
so that's one way that people are trying to deal with that. I'm going to tell one thing. If you had a single newspaper article that you wanted to preserve, say something about your family and it's in your scrapbook, you can take some milk of magnesia and some club soda and make a little bath.
Okay.
And soak your article in it overnight. Let it dry, press it with an iron, and that'll help preserve it.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
Yeah, because magnesium, goes into the paper, especially with newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one little tip you can try if you had singular items.
It's like household tips that you can take away for everyday use. And when you said to press it with an iron, I assume you're putting like a cloth or something over it. You want to make sure someone does not put an iron on the paper. They just soak it.
Low temperature. And so also freezing, like a lot of times when we get collections in that have been in basements or attics or something, they could have a lot of those pests in the boxes. And so we would take the items out and bag them up and put them in a freezer for 3 days. And that will kill any of the pests or eggs that are in the materials.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so before we introduce them into the archives room, we want to make sure that we don't bring those things in with the material.
Right, that makes sense. Well, that's always a big problem in libraries. If someone either donates or returns a book that's gotten wet, because books do drop in the lake here in the Lakes region. That has happened. I might have heard that a time or two. And anyway, so if someone returns a book that's moldy, you do not want that in the building, because you do not want those spores to be spread from, the contaminated item throughout your collection. So that's really a big, challenge for libraries, and something to control.
And that's what the freezing can help with the mold problem too, because there's mold on everything. It just sort of takes the right environment to make it come out. So if you have active mold on something, you definitely want to stop that.
Yeah, contain it. Sure.
Yeah.
All right. So then what happens to material that is beyond repair? Is there such a thing, and can it be disposed of?
If it's something you really want to preserve, I would seek out a conservator. There's all kinds of conservators, so they have specialties. And a paper conservator can tell you what can be done. They may be able to put it on a different background and vacuum, adhere it, whatever pieces are obtainable to do that. If it's something, very significant, it might be a way to go. So I would check with the conservator first. And a conservator is a specialized person, like I said earlier, that has a background in chemistry. And so they know all of the different techniques. They often would tell us as archivists, you can go this far yourself with preserving things, but when you get to a certain point, you call us.
Okay.
Because we could do damage beyond those things we have been trained.
Right.
And the other thing is if something was really beyond, is to document it, photograph it, write up a paragraph about where it came from, what it is, why it's important, and why you had to get rid of it, And so that way, at least you have documentation and some photographs about what you got rid of.
Okay.
So those would be the things I would advise.
So earlier we mentioned professional organizations for archivists, and one of the things that I thought of, is there an archivist code of ethics? And can you think of a situation you know of, not with you, of course, where that could be compromised? Is there such a thing as that, or did I just make that up?
You did not make that up. And actually, being an archivist calls for a lot of judgment. And like I was saying, like what is significant, what is important. And we can be biased. And so in our code of ethics, we strive to be transparent, to be more like journalists and neutral, because we do have to do a lot of writing in describing these collections. And so we try our best to avoid bias and judgment and do our best to protect collections and create access. There's also a lot of privacy concerns. So say you have a collection of an artist, for example, and maybe they had kind of a wild life and all their correspondence is in there and things might be very private, but
sensitive.
Yet their records are donated. Now their records may be donated after they pass away.
Right.
And so how might that person feel about having those things exposed? Now, if you're a biographer and you want to write a biography of that artist, you kind of want to know all the sides of that person.
Right, exactly.
So it can be very helpful to have those private things in the collection. Sometimes we can also restrict things. And so a case, for example, where a family whose collection I processed had several sisters that wrote many, many letters to each other and about their children. And one of the sisters had a problem child that had to see a psychiatrist. And that daughter was still living and didn't really want that exposed in a public archive. And so you can restrict those folders for 25 or 50 years. You actually seal them. And when the date comes, because generations will have passed and maybe that person will have passed away, then people feel comfortable maybe exposing some of that material.
Okay.
But there's been cases I've known of where, say, there were lawsuits and someone comes in to look at records, and if you were an archivist and you knew there were things you should show them and you didn't, that would be a breach of ethics. I also discovered some personal items in a collection once, which were very personal. Sort of an affair this person had, and I was doing their family papers, and I didn't know what to do with that material, including the Polaroids.
Oh my goodness.
So that was kind of a moral dilemma. Do they know? Should I tell them? Should I get rid of this? What do I do?
So can you tell us what you did? I should leave this as a cliffhanger between two parts of this interview.
I felt that the letters belonged to the person who wrote them.
Okay.
And since the recipient had died, I tried to get in touch with that person. So that's all I'll really say about that.
That's fair. There was another aspect of this question I guess I was thinking of also, with the competing interests of preserving history accurately and modern sensibilities. And I'm sure you've come across that, you could be talking about issues of slavery and the language that was used. So there's that, that push and pull of trying to, balance the modern sensibility with the integrity of the source material. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, in our ethics, there's another field called cultural competency, and it addresses that very thing.
Okay.
And actually, I had worked with some tribes and in California and their archives, and that is one area where this comes up a lot. But at the Bancroft Library, we also collected things like propaganda and inflammatory materials because it's important to know that those things existed and how they were used. And so in the context of collecting, I think it's important And we then go back, and newspapers are one of the media where you see how they discussed groups of people, whether it was the Japanese Americans or Native Americans, and a lot of the inflammatory language that was used. When I visited in Washington, the African American History Museum, just recently, the interpretation to the public of these materials is sensitive. And I think now when I work with these groups, whether it's tribes or other groups of people about their culture, is they want to speak for themselves. And that's the main really focus of how they want to be seen and heard in their own voice. And so when I'm a white female writing about maybe a collection on slavery or something like that, I do want to try to talk to people and confer with their groups and get their feedback about what they think I've written. And, maybe I haven't gotten it quite right.
This is so far beyond the stereotype of a person sitting there alone going through dusty boxes. I mean, you've really opened our eyes, I think, to how fascinating and complicated the entire industry and the profession is. So I really appreciate that you were able to come and do that with us today. All right. So that being said, Carola, are there any other secrets of the trade that you've learned along the way?
I've learned that working with donors is very sensitive, and people who are donating their own collections or the collections of their family or their organization, they want to trust the archive that they deposit their material to. And that, these ethics and standards that we go by are an important part of developing that trust in those conversations when they agree to donate their material. At the Bancroft Library, I had some projects where I was sent actually to the donors' houses instead of them bringing the collection to the library.
That's interesting.
They were very cautious and sensitive, and they wanted to directly work with the archivist on making sure that everything was done properly. And so those were some challenging projects that turned out really well because I was able to develop that trust, and that was really gratifying. I've had some things called archival moments in my career, and I'll just finish up with that.
All right.
Here's one that I loved was one day I was working with an intern, and we took out a family photo collection, and we spread all of the pictures out on this big table, and we were trying to identify the different people from the information we had. And it was a family where they had the same names for a lot of generation, like Stephen. And so you had to figure out which generation it was and that kind of thing. And so we were puzzling all these photos when a knock came on the door, and some people had been sent down from the visitor center to the museum to ask about their family, because their family was from the area. And I invited them in, and I asked them who their family was.
It was Stephen.
It was. It was. And these people, I was in California. These people were visiting from the day from New York. And they came in, and I said, here's your family. This is what we have, along with some other documents. And they were able to help us identify almost all the people in the photographs.
Right. You couldn't have planned that if you tried.
No. I think that, anyone who's considering a career in archives will have a fun time exploring all the different facets of it. So go for it.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Carola, on this episode. It was just fascinating getting to know you more and learning so much about the another part of our industry that I did not know about. And I think our listeners will feel the same way. So when they're in the library or at the Friends of the Library meetings, they should definitely tell you that they heard this, and they can ask their own questions too. So we'll make you even more famous here.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, Matthew.
All right. Thank you so much. And thank you to all our listeners. We will look forward to having you join us again for the next exciting episode of Check It Out. Bye, everyone. Podcast music titled Daytime TV Theme by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com. Licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0.
Podcast copyright 2026, Meredith Library Podcast Studio.